April 23rd, 1945, 14:20 hours, outskirts of Bremen, Germany. Sergeant William Morrison, East Yorkshire Regiment, crouched behind a tumbled wall and steadied his binoculars on a wrecked schoolhouse. The platoon had been edging through the suburb for 3 hours. Short rushes, hand signals, brick dust in the teeth, trading fire with what sounded like Volkssturm, not regular Wehrmacht. Now the last stubborn shots were coming from classrooms where equations once lived. Morrison gave the quiet, push-forward wave. The lead section flowed through the door, boots soft, muzzles up, the learned ballet of men who'd survived too many rooms already. They expected the usual end, a burst, a shout, a body, or hands up, mouths tight, eyes hot. What they found instead stopped the whole machine. 12 figures sat against the cracked plaster with rifles slid away and hands raised. Not men, boys. The oldest might be 16. A few were 13 or 14, faces hollow with hunger and fear, uniforms 3 sizes too large, boots stuffed with paper, helmets that made their necks look thin and breakable. One boy cried quietly. Another whispered in stitched-together English, "Bitte, please, do not shoot." Morrison lowered his rifle first. His section followed, the angle of danger dissolving into something stranger. Shock curdled with pity. Propaganda had prepared them for many things. It had not prepared them for children made into soldiers. "Corporal," Morrison said, holstering his pistol. "Get them out. Tea, rations, medical once over, and find a German speaker. I want them told, clearly, they're safe." Blankets appeared. Canteens changed hands. A private offered a cigarette to the oldest boy. Morrison shook his head no, then thought and nodded yes. The corporal with halting German arrived, words clumsy but kind. The boys stopped flinching, then started again, as if their bodies didn't believe what their heirs were learning. This wasn't torture. It wasn't a firing squad stretching out the moment. This was the British Army doing what it had been doing wherever possible for months, treating enemies like prisoners, and boys like boys. The last throw of a broken state. The Volkssturm, People's Storm, was the regime's final decree against the inevitable. Announced on 25th of September 1944, it conscripted every male between 16 and 60 not already in uniform. In practice, collapsing front lines and collapsing discipline pulled in boys as young as 12. A few days of drill, a Panzerfaust and an obsolete rifle, a speech about glory and death, then into street corners and hedgerows against professional armies with tanks, artillery, air cover, and momentum. By spring 1945, Germany had put over 6 million men on Volkssturm rolls. Perhaps 1.5 million actually saw combat. Between 100,000 and 150,000 of those were teenagers. Training, a week or two, sometimes just hours. Weapons, whatever could be scraped up. Captured Soviet. Rifles, old Mausers, a tube that killed tanks if you could stomach the distance, which was often suicidal. Indoctrination had primed them since age 10 through Hitler Youth. Discipline drilled into bones, lies lacquered over fears, courage defined as obedience, surrender equated with shame, worse than death. Allied soldiers, British in particular, were painted as torturers. Better to shoot yourself than be taken. Then reality arrived in the shape of regiments that had fought from desert to bocage to bridgeheads. Men who had learned caution without learning cruelty. Against that, Volkssturm positions cracked in hours, sometimes minutes. The casualty lists were obscene. The delays bought were measured in miles of graves and hours of advance. Capture, improvised. Right, what do you do with an enemy pointing a weapon who looks like your son or your kid brother? Doctrine says fire. Conscience stalls the trigger. The first British responses were improvised, then they became a rhythm. Disarm, reassure, feed, treat, Process. Morrison's decision in Bremen, T first forms later, was repeated from Minden to Hanover to the Elbe. The Somerset Light Infantry took 37 teenagers off a bridge near Minden, fed them, and found them dry socks before the paperwork. The Royal Scots pulled 21 boys out of a village north of Hanover and spent an afternoon convincing them that medical dressings were not the prelude to mutilation. The Durham Light Infantry stumbled on an entire Volkssturm company. 83 men and boys, average age barely 15, deserted by their elders and starving in a copse. The Durhams started a soup line. Everywhere, the same astonishment played across the boys' faces. The punishment they'd been promised never came. Instead came calm, not softness, but the firm, unhurried business of soldiers who keep rules because they are soldiers. The psychology of the no. For many child soldiers, capture began with a decision to die. Training and terror had taught them that the British would torture prisoners, gouge eyes, cut parts, drag out death as spectacle. Better the last bullet for yourself, they were told. British sergeants and privates found themselves grappling not just rifles, but wrists, knocking barrels away from mouths, kicking grenades clear, shouting, "Nick dumb," and "Don't be bloody stupid," at boys crying from fear and relief at the same time. Hans Weber, 15, captured by the Royal Norfolks near Celle, put it plainly years later. "I tried to shoot myself. A British soldier knocked the rifle away and swore at me. Like an elder brother, he forced his canteen on me. I could not understand this. They were supposed to be monsters. Instead, he kept me alive. Everything I believed about the British collapsed in that minute." The collapse didn't end there. In holding areas and trucks at field kitchens and aid posts, fairness repeated itself. Orders were crisp, discipline real, punishment, when required, was confinement or lost privileges, not fists. Those small consistencies did the big work. They broke propaganda's spell. Camp with rules and mercy. British POW camps were already complex organisms, barbed wire and barracks, infirmaries and football pitches, chapels and notice boards. Into this, the teenager cohorts arrived. Administrators adapted quickly and, when necessary, quietly. Separation. The youngest boys were billeted away from hardcore Nazis to prevent bullying and re-indoctrination. At Camp 186, near Nottingham, a dedicated block housed prisoners under 16. Food, rations, about 2,900 calories per day, were steadier and often better than what these boys had seen in months. Malnourished kids were moved to supplemented diets. Medicine. Wounds were treated as medical problems rather than moral exercises. Surgery and rehab matched British standards. Chaplains and medical officers watched for nightmares that didn't stop in daylight. Time. Football emerged everywhere. Guards refereed. For boys whose last games had been marching drills, the feel of a ball at the foot was a kind of amnesty. Most consequentially, the camps offered education. Many of these kids had stopped real schooling at 12. Camp 186 piloted classes: English, maths, basic science, carpentry, mechanics, farm work. British teachers volunteered. Prisoners attended at 90% plus rates because the connection between learning and survival was finally obvious. This was not a kindness tacked on to punishment. It was policy consistent with the idea that the war was about civilization, and civilization builds, work that heals. Britain still needed hands. With millions of British men overseas and the home front worn thin, POW labor filled the agricultural gap. Teenagers worked too, with adjustments, shorter hours, easier tasks, more supervision. The point wasn't to squeeze boy bodies for yield. It was to usefully occupy and carefully train. Franz Dietrich, 16, a Hamburg city boy before conscription, was sent to a Yorkshire farm. He worked alongside Land Army women under Robert Harrison, who'd lost a son at Monte Cassino. Harrison showed, expected, corrected, never humiliated. Mrs. Margaret Harrison patched Franz's coat, pushed second helpings, asked about family. Franz, whose mother had died in the bombings, found himself answering in English he didn't know he had. Gratitude became competence. Competence became pride. Work has a way of introducing people to each other without speeches. Weather, crops, animals, these are shared problems. Germans learn to say hedge, gate, grease nipple. Farmers learn to say Guten Morgen and laugh at their own accent. Suspicion wore down where jobs and jokes met. By harvest, many villages quietly moved from the prisoners to the lads from the camp. One-to-one institutional decency matters. Individual decency changes lives. Corporal James Stevens of the Middlesex had lost a younger brother at Caen. When his unit took a knot of Volkssturm, including boys barely shaving, grief rose like bile. Among them was Klaus Hartmann, 14, orphaned by the Eastern Front and the Hamburg firestorms. Regulations said no fraternization. Command looked the other way. Stevens taught Klaus English in off hours, loaned him magazines, explained how Saturday afternoons worked in a country not being bombed. When repatriation came months later, Stevens gave Klaus his own warm coat and a reference letter, a simple document vouching for a boy in a broken nation. Stories like that multiplied. A guard slipped a book to a kid who always squinted at notices. A mechanic taught a teenager how to tune an engine. A chaplain listened while a boy told, haltingly once, then never again, what happened in the last shelled street. These weren't sentimental exceptions. They were the texture of a policy that invited virtue. Christmas, 1945. The first peacetime Christmas came to camps still full. Commandants permitted decorations, services, and special meals within ration limits. Guards added from their own pay, cigarettes, chocolate, a bit of something wrapped for the youngest. At Camp 186, the under-16s organized a service in the chapel. Candles, rough paper stars, a bowed branch as a tree. They sang Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum, voices breaking, then finding strength. Outside, British sentries paused and listened with their hands behind their backs, the way soldiers do when made to be still. Afterwards, the commandant spoke through an interpreter. He did not make a speech about guilt, he said. You lived. Many didn't. Take that as a charge. Build something better when you go home. Dinner was modest and miraculous. Turkey, vegetables, bread, even a small pudding. Some boys cried without making noise. Others laughed because laughter is also a release valve. It was melancholy and hopeful at once. Far from home, but no longer in hell. The long undoing indoctrination isn't a lecture. It's repetition of contrary evidence. The British Army in northern Germany and the British state in its camps produced that evidence day after day. A mug of tea thrust into a shaking hand. A bandage tied as if the skin under it mattered. A rule applied the same to all. A punishment that respected the punished. A class that expected you to try. A match refereed by a man who last week shouted at you to keep your head down. The boys' stories often moved through the same stages. Terror of capture worse than death. Confusion at not being hurt. Suspicion that kindness masked cruelty. Reluctant trust when food and fairness repeated. Engagement, work, lessons, games. Re-evaluation of what civilization looked like in practice. Not all transformations were neat. Some boys clung to hatred. Trauma does not obey timetables. But enough changed that the post-war arithmetic shifted. Boys who expected to become bitter men became useful ones instead. Carpenters and drivers and foremen and fathers who told their children a different story about the enemy. Going home. Not the same repatriation, ramped through late 1946 and 1947. Trains filled with uniforms that now fit, faces that could look out of windows. Some boys returned to ruins and extended families improvising new arrangements. Some, with no one left to take them in, were placed in homes or apprenticeships by German agencies that were rebuilding as fast as paper and ink allowed. A number stayed on in Britain as civilian workers, temporarily, because farms still needed hands and because stability is not a thing you refuse when offered. Wages replaced camp stipends, billets gave way to cottages, curfews softened into common sense. The same dawn bells, the same tools. The difference was weighty and simple. Choice. They wrote letters across decades. Telegrams crossed for weddings. In 1970-something, a former boy stood at the grave of a British farmer and sang a hymn in English he had once sung in German as a prisoner. Hands were squeezed. Thanks were said with the kind of plainness that honors both speaker and listener. Why it mattered beyond kindness. It is easy to misfile this story under British benevolence. That misses the harder truth. What happened in schoolrooms and farmyards, billets and barracks, was the British state and British soldiers keeping standards on purpose. Not because the enemy deserved it, but because the British did. The results ran along 3 tracks. Operational, prisoners cared for were easier to manage, less likely to revolt, more likely to provide accurate information. Societal, fairness practiced in front of thousands of future German adults seeded a political culture that chose ballots over barricades. Morale, a democracy showed that it could fight total war without becoming the thing it fought. These weren't abstractions. They were meals, rules, and the tone of a sergeant's voice when he said no to a boy trying to die and yes to a boy asking for another book. Back to Bremen Morrison's 12 were processed the next morning with the gentleness efficiency allows. Names, ages, units, if any. Addresses, if they had one. A medic changed a dressing and scolded a lad for not telling him about a fever sooner. The interpreter repeated the same sentences until they were believed. You will not be harmed. You will be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. You will have food and shelter. When we can, we will send you home. On the way to the collection point, they passed a garden where spring had started despite everything. One boy stared at the flowers, the way you stare at something you thought had been cancelled. Morrison kept the binoculars slung, but idle. He watched his men walk with children they would have shot 15 minutes earlier if they'd had to. He felt older than the wall he leaned on. He said nothing, because sometimes nothing is the only respectful thing to say. The lasting lesson. Wars end in 2 ways, with a list of enemies to remember or with a list of standards to keep. In northern Germany, spring 1945, British units, tired, angry, disciplined, chose the latter. That choice did not absolve. It defined. The boys told different stories to their children because of it, not we were hunted like animals. But they stopped me from killing myself. Not they starved us, but they made me eat slowly and taught me a trade. Not they hated us, but they treated us fairly, and I changed my mind. Mercy here was not indulgence. It was strategy and identity braided together. It turned potential enemies of a future Germany into citizens of one instead. It closed a door that vengeance would have left ajar. German child soldiers expected no mercy. The British gave them something better. Standards held, rules kept, humanity insisted on, until boys stopped being soldiers and started being boys again.